So I intentionally left the closing keynote kind of open, right? Very unscripted. I just thought we'd try to see if we could put a little bow around what it is that we did today. So was my hypothesis valid? Is there a conversation here to be had? Is this a conversation that we need to keep going with over time? Okay, excellent. One of the things that, it was interesting, because I was sitting in the back and listening to all of these talks for the first time. And what I thought was really interesting, and it'd actually be kind of cool if anybody had any comments or anything, or maybe hit me at the reception afterwards. But it's like, there's kind of like a tension between the team level stuff and the enterprise stuff, right? And you keep feeling the energy almost want to go down into the team, as I talked about right before lunch. But we know that we need to pull it up, right, to elevate it into the enterprise conversation. And I've been thinking about it all day, like back channel texting my team and things like that, and trying to figure out, like, was that a scripting of the conference challenge? Was that just a reality of our world kind of challenge? And what I think's interesting about it is that we know that the team level agility stuff is absolutely necessary. It's just not sufficient, right? And so when we talk about structure, right, structure always starts with how do we form teams? But what's interesting, right, so we talk about how do we form teams. Well, we form them around business capabilities. Business capabilities are aligned to technology. And business capabilities tie up into strategy execution. And so the narrative that's kind of like weaving through as I'm kind of listening that maybe we need to figure out how to make just a little bit more explicit is it's how does that articulation of strategy drive down through business capabilities and then get realized in the teams. So maybe that's like one thing that maybe I'd just like to try to just make just a tad bit explicit, maybe for next time. Would that be kind of a reasonable thing to do? You guys think? But the other thing that's kind of interesting is there's a thought exercise that I do with folks quite a bit, and I call it like king for a day kind of a thing. And one of the things that I ask myself, or I ask rooms full of people all the time, is if you were king for a day in your organization and you could do anything you wanted to, right? You could change culture, you could change structures, you could change the governance model, people's attitudes, like just flip a switch and just anything would change. The question that you have to ask yourself is, do you know what you would change? Who thinks they know what they would change? Right? Maybe a few, right? And I think that's kind of part of our challenge as an industry a little bit, is I think sometimes that we get really focused on whether it be like agile mindset kinds of things or agile culture. Sometimes we get really focused on agile practices. And if we were king, right, if we could do anything we wanted to, most people don't really have an answer to that question. And as I was noodling on like themes and things that I wanted to talk about, anybody here like Stephen Covey, 7 Habits person? Huge, right? I had a boss when I was like 29 years old who forced me to read that book. Like literally forced me, like said, you have to read this or I'm gonna fire you kind of a thing. I actually probably wouldn't have fired me, but he definitely was a direct order. And I read that book when I was like 29 and it kind of bounced off me. I went, yeah, okay, cool, whatever. Read it again at 31 and I've probably read that book 10 times ever since. Right? Maybe even more, right? I've listened to it on audiobook. And one of the things that I actually texted him, I was on a plane, I probably shouldn't say this, but I was on a plane drinking scotch, and I texted my old boss and I said, hey, just thank you for making me read that book, because basically everything in my life, everything in how I've built the company, basically everything in leading Agile's transformation model is all centered around fundamentally the 7 habits. And I was thinking about the idea, does anybody remember what the first habit is? It's like be proactive, right? And within the be proactive, Covey talks about the idea of circle of influence versus circle of concern. And I think about that a lot from a transformation perspective. Because some of the tension that we feel in going through a transformation, if we are not the person at the top, is that our circle of influence is much smaller than our circle of concern a lot of times. And I think as an industry, that one of the things that we get into is we operate within the agency that we have. We do the things that are in front of us that we can actually do, right? Because that's at the end of the day the only thing you can do. And so, again, I think a lot of times that's why this conversation around Agile starts at the team level, because most of us, that's the only thing that we can actually impact. Okay? So we're trying to operate within the agency that we have within the organization. But if anybody remembers that first habit, be proactive, we have to be excellent within our circle of influence, right? And our circle of influence grows into our circle of concern. Now, it almost sounds like maybe I'm making the case for like a grassroots transformation, and I'm not, because there's a couple of different things. Like one of the things, like when we were a little company, like, not too many years ago, not super huge company now compared to you guys, but 120 people or so, right? And one of the things that we would do is we would come in and we would just engage in the transformation wherever anybody would let us engage in the transformation. And what we would try to do over time is to be so good at this level, but casting the vision forward to let the executives understand like where it needed to go. And in a lot of our clients, right, it would get small and it would get bigger and it would get bigger and it would get bigger until we could create kind of enough of a presence in market to where we could tell the bigger story. And so maybe like one of the first things that I wanted to kind of share with you as we wrap up the day is even if you only have agency to operate in the small, we have to be excellent operating in the small so that we get permission to be able to operate in the large. If we have permission to operate in the large, we have to be really, really good stewards of the pieces of the organization that we're working on in the small so that we can evolve and gain agency over time. Like one of the stories Amy mentioned in the Ford readout that she did, and that was awesome, by the way. I really appreciated her coming in. I appreciate everybody who spoke coming and speaking. Is that wasn't like a thing where it was like the CIO basically said, here's permission for everything, go do it all at once, right? That was Amy and her team being good stewards of the pieces of the organization they had, delivering with excellence in where they had agency, and then building consensus and building alignment, right? It seems like you walk in with that big plan and everything's just kind of like, oh yeah, you get alignment, you do this, right? It wasn't actually like that, right? It was a lot of like, be really good with what you've been trusted with and earn permission to go do the rest of it, okay? So start within your circle of influence, wherever that happens to be, and use the excellence of your delivery to gain permission to do the wider pieces. Now, where I think that's been misapplied often is that sometimes that we focus on the team level and we expect it to solve the bigger problem. One of the things that a couple of the speakers talked about was the idea of the unit of value in a transformation is really a transformed organization. So rather than go horizontal, building out agile teams, right? Build enough of the agile teams, build enough of the program layer, build enough of the portfolio layer, link it to enough of the strategy, that we have a demonstrable business value focused slice across the enterprise. Does that make sense? Operate within your circle of influence and grow it until you start to encompass more of your circle of concern. So that's kind of probably the first thing that I want to talk about. Another person that I want to talk about who I'm a huge fan of, and he falls really into the Stephen Covey category for me. Anybody familiar with Christopher Avery and his work around the responsibility process? Well, so what Christopher talks about in short is that taking responsibility is something that you can learn to do. And I might not get this exactly right, and I've been following him for like 10 years, so if Christopher's watching this, and I'll have to apologize in advance, but it basically articulates a process of progressive responsibility that starts with like denial, and then blame, and then goes to, I want to say, shame and obligation, and then ultimately into responsibility. And at one point, there's like an option to quit, and that kind of a thing. And one time, I think it was a couple years ago, I was out in Austin doing kind of my standard transformation talk, and Christopher came up and said something that in Christopher's world is a very, very high compliment, I think. And he goes, that's a very responsible way to approach transformation. And I think a lot of what's noodling around in my head around why this conversation around Agile needs to be elevated in the marketplace is a lot of the things that I hear, right, just anecdotally through blogs and other speakers and things like that, is I don't know that we're taking responsibility for the outcomes that we're promising. One of the things I talk about, does anybody remember the cartoon? It's probably 20, 30 years old now. It's like two scientists standing at the board, and there's a bunch of math on this side, and there's a bunch of math on that side, and the one scientist says the other, and then a miracle happens here, right? And, or no, he says, yeah, it's like a miracle happens here, and then the line on the cartoon is, I think you need to be more explicit in step 2, right? That's the punchline. Sorry, I totally blew the punchline on that one. So it's been a long day. There's scotch, right? It's all good, right? So, so the idea is that being responsible about your Agile transformation is fundamentally about being explicit about step 2. So it's not just, yes, we need to form teams, but it's asking yourself, how are we going to form teams, and what are we going to form them around? And actually having an answer. Not, I'm going to tell the team they need to do Scrum and let them go figure it out and self-organize, and then just hope that they solve it, right? As change agents, as leaders within our organizations, we have to have a point of view on what is the right organizational metaphor for figuring out how to form teams. If we're going to have networks of teams, what does that structure look like? What's the hierarchy of it, right? How does the flow of value all come together? If we're going to do governance and we're going to say, okay, we need to work with smaller batches of the portfolio, and we need to decompose portfolio items into smaller items at the program level, and then we need to feed those smaller items into business capability-focused teams, right? We actually need to go and think through and define how that is going to happen. Like, how are we going to enable the predictable, steady throughput at the business capability-focused team level, right? How is that going to very specifically enable options at the strategy level to make sure that the business can achieve its goals, right? We need to have an answer to that question. What are we going to measure along the way from a business value perspective, on one hand, a financial perspective, but also what are we going to measure so that we're accountable to the rest of the organization so that we can basically say, we called our shot, we put the 8-ball in the corner pocket, we said we were going to do this, we did it, here's the business benefit that you got from it. I don't think that that is a conversation that most folks are having. I think they're basically saying, teach people Agile, a miracle happens, and then we get this business benefit on the backside. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is how are we more explicit in step 2? Okay? And so taking responsibility for the outcomes that we're promising, basically committing to our organizations that we not only have a point of view, but we have a plan for how to get there, I think is the next frontier of this conversation. And so again, I think as I listened from the back of the room, I think all those themes were in there, okay? So I think we launched the conversation. I'm happy with that. But I think we need to make some of those things a little bit more explicit. I encourage you guys to make them more explicit, okay? And so I think that's pretty much all I really wanted to say. So again, if you're king for a day, you need to have a plan. You need to operate within your circle of influence, operate with excellence, and grow and minimize your circle of concern, right? Grow your influence in the organization. And absolutely take responsibility for the commitments that you guys are making. And to make sure that you understand and have an incremental and iterative plan for not only how to manage the transformation, how to do rollouts, how to make sure that the team level execution that is kind of prevalent is rolled up into strategy execution. And I think if we can keep this conversation going, I think that we can figure out how to really have some meaningful conversations and make sure that we're not getting really candidly marginalized, right, in this conversation.